how can we exist as our truest selves yet in the environments, in the structures, in the societies, within the systems that conditioned us to be this shadow self. So let's get into it. Hi, my friend. Perspective here. Sharing the journey so far. I'm building up on that. So far, so good. We've been exploring how we transition from that wounded shadow self into truer, freer, lighter, authentic version of self. So, having gone on this journey, we are at this point where we're letting go of the old versions of self. We're doing the inner work. We are healing. We're transforming. But the world around us hasn't caught up yet. The world around us is still in its own version of wounding. So the world around us hasn't caught up yet. Now, how do we navigate the world as these new versions of self that are emerging? How do we exist in an environment, in environments, within structures that conditioned us in this way? And now we have to keep evolving, but then we're in these environments still, we're still coming in contact with people, experiences, places, things, societies, structures that are familiar with a version of us that no longer exists, are familiar with a version of us that is undergoing transformation. So how do we exist? This is a very interesting one because on my journey, having gone through and still going through this journey, I found myself encountering situations where it's like it brought out those sides of me again. And to me, I wondered how that even was a thing because I mean, I thought I was doing the inner work, I thought I was evolving, but then I would find myself in these environments, within these constructs, within these systems, and those versions would pop out. And so, yeah, that's what we're exploring today. Who are we? Where are we at right now? And how do we move forward? When you decide to go on this journey, and I'm speaking to people who have decided to go on this journey, I'm speaking to people who have gone on this journey and are at this point in their journey. It feels as though you can no longer relate to the world around you. It feels as though you start to see things from a different perspective than you had been seeing before, right? And considering that to a degree, all of these things I'm saying are a reflection of my own experience. But again, as you find things that resonate, you find your own experience within my experience. That's the idea. As you get to this point in your journey, you realize that you had been viewing life through certain perspectives, and that is shifting. That has shifted to a degree, and it is still shifting. So there are certain things that you start to see that you couldn't see before. There are certain things that you observe in your environment that you couldn't observe before. So now you see things, but not everyone sees these things that you see, right? You feel things. Not everyone feels these things that you feel. So, how do you, as a person who has gone through this process, who is going through this process, who is finding new versions of self, how do you interact, relate? How do you show up in your truest, most authentic version yet, in the most unconditionally loving way that you can show up in your environment? But understanding that your environment hasn't caught up yet. So, a couple of things to note here is one thing being that the systems that exist in the world, the systems that exist, the structures that exist, the environment that exists around us, society, however you want to call it, operates in a certain way, right? And as you go on this journey, you start to see these things for yourself. You can call it the veil being lifted off your eyes, but essentially they operate in a certain way. And not much to our advantage, because for us to have gone on this journey, for us to have seen that there was a shadow side that were created based on the conditions that we found ourselves in, that would mean that that shadow self was not serving us, right? To a degree, because again, all is in the becoming. And as we go on this journey, we see how we had to go through these things so that when we're unraveling these things for ourselves, it just becomes our power, our pain becomes our power. So I'm of the opinion that it was meant to happen in the ways that it happened, even though it's hurtful, even though it's scary. There is a greater good at the end of the day. That's how I see it. But if we're being more, would I say realistic with the things that we see, right? Again, understanding that all is in the becoming, our pain becomes our purpose. That is having gone on this journey. But realistically speaking, the pains that were passed on to us were not for our good at the time. It wasn't a nice thing. It wasn't a pleasurable experience, which is why we had to go on this journey to find that for ourselves. So at that point, we're seeing that these experiences, these pains, these shadows were actually a ripple effect of the world that we live in, of the society, of the environment. And in reality, these do not serve us. So when we think about bigger societies, the world at large, smaller societies, organizations, these are places where all these character traits, all these wounded tendencies, all these pains were perpetuated, were rippled into. When we think about us as beings and how our brain works, how our mind works, based off of every experience that we come to in life, we're in an experience in the moment. Why do we see things the way that we see them? And we spoke briefly about this when we spoke on the theme of consciousness and how that it's essentially the lens through which you see life. It means that technically every one of us has a filter with which we observe life. So three people could be looking at the same exact thing, but we could interpret it in different ways. And that's the work of the brain. You can call it the mind. So I like to think that the mind just wants to conserve as much energy as possible. There's so much going on in our system. There's so much going on autopilot that we don't even know about. So to me, it's like our brain has to conserve resources and energy. And there's so many things that happen on autopilot, including how we perceive situations, how we perceive experiences. And if you recall, in the previous episodes, I had mentioned when a trigger comes up, again, you're in an altercation within an experience, and someone does something to you, or something just happens. It may not even be done to you particularly, but the way that you perceive the situation, it tips that trigger off. And you find that triggering because it resembles something that has happened to you in the past. Now, is it the same thing? No. But your senses, you have five senses. You see with your eyes, you smell with your nose, you taste with your mouth, you feel or touch with your skin, and you hear with your ears. So when we're in an experience, all of these five senses are active. That's how we interact with our environment physically, with our physical environment. So there is something going on, and then there is a perception of that thing. How do we perceive it? With our five senses. We hear, we see what is going on. These are the sensory cues. It could be visual, it could be auditory, it could be something that you're smelling, it could be something that you're feeling. But these cues exist depending on the context, depending on the situation. And for each individual, your brain, your central nervous system is connected to, and I'm going to be biology here, but I invite you to explore this with me because this gives you a more broken down understanding of what exactly is going on in these scenarios and how like these are bodily responses, right? So stick with me. In a situation, we pick up all of these sensory impulses, sensory insights, sensory signals. And as our body picks it up, it's connected to our brain. Now, our brain has its own, what I would call a mental construct or a mental structure. You can think about it like, and this is for the tech buddies and the tech guys, you can think about it like a data structure. A data structure primarily stores data in a way that it can be synthesized so that you get information at the end of the day. So our brain works just like a computer. The computer is created from the brain as a template. So your brain takes all of these signals as input, it processes it, and as it takes it, it stores it within the mental construct or the mental system. And what that looks like is based on your own personal experience, based on other experiences that are passed on to you. So these could be cultural or societal constructs that are being passed on to the next generation, right? Like in my culture, I'm Igbo. There are certain things that we do. There are certain ways that we live life that is different from another culture, right? And these are things that you see across. So based on those belief systems or based on those truths, information, insights, concepts, ideologies that are created within a cultural context that is being passed on to the next generation. Because the idea is that the elders that have come before you have experienced certain things. And so they have experienced it, lived it, and they've been passed on from generation to generation because this is believed as a truth for them. So cultural beliefs are being passed on. You could also have personal experiences because again, the idea of these cultural beliefs are being passed on. Some of them you don't even know where they originated from, but it has been validated across the culture and it has been passed on to the next generation. In the case of a personal experience, you get to choose because it's like, oh, you lived this for yourself and now you know, okay, this is how I experienced this and this is what came about. All of this, again, cultural beliefs, societal beliefs, constructs based on a group of people, as well as your own individual experience in the past, from memory, all of these start to create the mental construct, the mental structure, the mental system. You can also call it your belief system. So again, the analogy with the data structure. It saves all of these truths, beliefs, ideologies, concepts into a storage system, right? For my girlies and my guys that aren't tech inclined, think about it like a bucket. You have a bucket, you store water in a bucket, right? And that has a large volume of water. So in this case, you have all of these ideologies, beliefs, truths, all of these are being stored in that bucket that you call your mental construct. Now, the brain tries to be as efficient as possible in its processing. So it doesn't want to waste time, right? When you can use that same energy to do other processes and run other processes within the body. So whenever there is an experience, now back to my example, whenever there is an experience or interaction, moment in life where you're going through whatever the situation is, you are interacting with your environment, you're interacting with someone, and all of these signals are being sent as input into your brain. Now, remember, your brain has this bucket that is already filled with prior experiences, memories, cultural ideologies, belief systems, all that stuff. Now, it has all of these truths, and these are narratives, these are stories. And that's why when we talk about doing the three-step process of the inner work, we speak on one, identifying your thoughts, feelings, and actions that are connected to a specific trigger, but then also identifying the belief system. And at the end of the day, releasing that to replace it with new narratives. And that's why we include the healing themes narratives as well as the enlightenment narrative. So, the reason I say this is we see how the narratives are what we replace with. And that's because these narratives, these stories, these truths are what make up the belief system. They are what make up the mental constructs, the mental structure. They are the things that fill up the bucket. So the bucket is filled up with all of these things. Now, when you experience something, your brain is not experiencing the thing as it is most of the times. And especially as you, again, move from being in that unconscious state, which is the me version, which is the version of self that is heavily in the shadow, which is the ego self, as you want to call it. But it's unconscious because it just took all of this conditioning and doesn't even know it's perpetrating actions on autopilot. So, this is what I mean with the brain. You're in an experience, and your brain doesn't actually experience the thing because guess what? That experience goes through a filter being your theme of consciousness, a filter being